Have you ever wondered how to create a dynamic web application using Python? Today, you'll learn just that. We are going to embark on a journey where we'll build a web app from scratch using Python, Flask, HTML, and CSS. Prior knowledge of these tools would be beneficial, but don't worry if you're not an expert yet. First things first, let's set the stage by creating our Python virtual environment. This is an essential step as it allows us to isolate our project and avoid any potential conflicts with other Python projects you might have on your system. So, let's dive in. Start by opening your terminal or command prompt, then type in python-m venv myappnv, replacing myappnv with the name you want for your environment. Once you've done that, activate it using the appropriate command for your operating system. With your virtual environment ready, you're set to start building your dynamic web app. Now, let's dive into Flask. It's a lightweight web server gateway interface application framework that's great for web development in Python. Flask is like a sturdy scaffold that lets you build dynamic web applications with ease. It stands out for its simplicity and fine-grained control, letting you decide how your application should work. Here's how to get started. First, ensure your virtual environment is activated. Then, simply install Flask with the command pip install Flask. The next step is to create a basic Flask application. Let's start with a classic, Hello World. To do this, create a new Python file and import Flask. Then, set up a route with the decorator @app.route and define a function underneath that returns Hello World. Lastly, run your application with if=ap.run. Voila, you've just created your first Flask application. It's simple, but it's a start. With a basic Flask app running, you can start designing the back end of your web application. A Flask app is similar to a tree. It has a root, branches, and leaves. The root, or the core of your app, is the Flask object, typically named app. The branches are your routes, leading to the leaves, your views or web pages. Routes in Flask are defined using the @app.route decorator. This decorator tells Flask what URL should trigger our function, or in other words, which branch leads to which leaf. For instance, @app.route/home will trigger the home function whenever a user navigates to your website.com/home. Now let's talk about views. Views are functions that respond to requests from web browsers. They can handle different types of HTTP requests, like GET and POST. For example, a view might return a Hello World message for a GET request, or store data from a form submitted with a POST request. But we don't want to just return plain text, do we? That's where templates come in. Templates are files that contain static data as well as placeholders for dynamic data. They allow us to generate HTML dynamically, presenting different information based on the context. Flask uses a powerful templating engine called Jinja 2. You can create a template with HTML and use placeholders for dynamic content. These placeholders are enclosed in double curly braces, like this. Variable. Then in your view function, you can use the render template function to fill these placeholders with real data when serving the page. When handling requests and responses, remember to import request from Flask. It will contain the data sent by the client to the server. For responses, you can use the JSONify function to send JSON responses back to the client. So to sum up, you've learned how to structure your Flask app, define routes and views, handle HTTP requests and responses, and use templates for rendering views. You've built the backbone of your web application. Now let's add some data. A dynamic web application needs data. In this segment, you'll learn how to integrate a database into your Flask app. Databases are the treasure troves of your application. They store, organize, and manage data, giving your web application the power to recall, analyze, and manipulate information to serve your users better. To integrate a database with our Flask app, we'll be using Flask SQL Alchemy, a Flask extension that simplifies database operations. It's a powerful tool that lets you interact with your data in a Pythonic way, and it supports a variety of database systems. Now, the first step to working with Flask SQL Alchemy is to define a database model. Think of a model as a blueprint for how your data should be structured. Each model corresponds to a table in the database, and each attribute of the model represents a column in the table. For instance, if we're creating a blog, our post model might have attributes like title, content, and author. Once we have our models defined, we can perform basic create, read, update, delete, or CRUD operations. When we talk about CRUD operations, we're referring to the 4 basic functions that models should be able to do. Create is about making new records. Read is about retrieving data. Update is about modifying existing records. And delete is about removing records. To create a new record, we instantiate a new object of the model class, fill in the details, and add it to our session. Reading data can be as simple as querying the model class. Updating a record involves fetching it, making changes, and adding it back to the session. And to delete a record, we fetch it and pass it to the session's delete method. Remember, Flask SQL Alchemy is not just about CRUD operations. It also provides a high-level Pythonic interface to advanced SQL concepts, allowing you to further manipulate and analyze your data. Your Flask app now interacts with a database. But a web application is not just about the backend. The front end is what users see and interact with. Let's see how to implement it using HTML and CSS. In the world of web development, there are 2 key players that make our websites look good and function well: HTML and CSS. HTML, or Hypertext Markup Language, is the foundation of any web page. It gives structure to our content, creating elements like headings, paragraphs, and links. Meanwhile, CSS, or Cascading Style Sheets, is the interior designer of the web. It styles and lays out web pages, transforming a plain HTML document into a visually engaging web page. Now let's talk about creating HTML templates. Templates are reusable HTML files that allow us to maintain a consistent website design across multiple web pages. With Flask, we can use the Jinja 2 template engine to create dynamic web pages. This means we can inject Python code into our HTML files, allowing us to customize content for different users or display data from our database. To create a template, we simply write an HTML file, then place it in a templates directory in our project folder. We can use placeholders denoted by double curly brackets to represent dynamic content. In our Flask routes, we then use the render template function to replace these placeholders with actual data. Now on to CSS. CSS allows us to apply styles to HTML elements either individually or in groups. We can change colors, fonts, layouts, and much more. To use CSS in our project, we create a CSS file in a static directory, then link to it in our HTML files using the link tag. By combining HTML and CSS, we can create a dynamic, user-friendly front-end for our web application. We use HTML to structure our content, Flask and Jinja 2 to make it dynamic, and CSS to make it visually appealing. With a dynamic front-end in place, your web application is complete. Congratulations! You've just built a dynamic web application using Python and Flask. We've journeyed from setting up a virtual environment through back-end development with Flask to database integration and finally implementing the front-end with HTML and CSS. This is your springboard. Dive into the code, tinker with it, add new features. Python and Flask give you the tools to create. Now it's up to you to innovate. Keep experimenting, keep learning, and keep building. Until next time, happy coding.